The jar hit the boardwalk with a crack that silenced the whole crowd gathered outside the Concho Springs Town Hall, and Elsie Ramsey did not flinch when brown water and bits of rotted grass splattered across the toes of Mayor Silas Crane's polished boots. "That came out of the town, well, not 2 hours past," she said, her voice carrying clean over the murmur of the crowd. "The same well you told the railroad survey men was fit to drink. The same well that has put 9 of Don Rafael Ortiz's vaqueros flat on their backs with fever, and 2 of the trail crew besides." Silas Crane straightened his string tie and looked down at the mess on his boots, as though a chicken had done it, rather than a woman he had known since she was a girl in pigtails buying peppermint sticks in her father's store. "Miss Ramsey," he said, in the smooth voice he used for railroad men and church socials alike, "I understand you are worried for your father's customers, but a broken jar of ditch water proves nothing except that somebody threw a rock at a puddle. It is not a puddle. It is the town well, and you know it." Elsie reached into the canvas satchel at her hip and drew out a folded page, ink gone slightly blue at the creases from having been copied twice. "This is a manifest from your own freight office, dated 11 days ago. It shows 6 barrels of spring water hauled from Cottonwood Spring to the railroad survey camp, marked private stock, not for town sale. The same 11 days that the town well has been fouled with runoff from the stockyards, because you fenced the spring off from the ditch that used to carry clean water down to it." A ripple went through the crowd standing along the rail of the boardwalk, men in shirt sleeves and women with baskets on their arms, all of them turning to look first at the ruined page in her hand, and then at Crane's face, which had gone the color of raw dough. It was in that moment that Vernon Wells, still road-dusted from 6 hours in the saddle, stepped his horse up beside the water trough and looked hard at the paper Elsie held aloft. He recognized the manifest before she had finished reading a third of it aloud, because he had carried a copy of that very shipment order in his own saddlebag 3 weeks back, sealed for the freight office, and he had thought nothing of it at the time beyond a passing note that Crane's Ice House was doing brisk business with the surveyors. "She's telling it true," Vernon said, and every head in the crowd swung toward him instead, because a male rider's word carried weight in a town that depended on him to bring news of the outside world twice a week. "I carried that order myself from the depot at Fort Concho. Crane's man signed for 6 barrels of spring water, all of it billed to the railroad camp. I remember it because it was the only paying freight that week that wasn't beef or hides." Crane's jaw worked as though he were chewing something bitter. A male rider hauls paper. He doesn't read a man's private business, and he certainly doesn't stand a corner of the street accusing his neighbors. "I don't read private business," Vernon agreed, swinging down from the saddle with the ease of a man who had spent more hours on a horse than off one. "But I do read a dead cow when I ride past it, and there's 3 of them bloated up along the ditch behind your ice house, Silas, not 30 yards from where that spring feeds into your holding tank. A blind man could smell what killed them." The crowd's murmur turned to something with an edge to it now, low and dangerous, the kind of sound that could tip toward a hanging or toward nothing at all depending on which way the next few words fell. Elsie felt the weight of it settle on her chest, but she did not step back. She had translated too many hard conversations between men who wanted to fight and men who wanted to be heard to let a crowd's temper decide the truth before the truth had a chance to be spoken plain. "I am not accusing anyone of murder," she said, loud enough to cut through the muttering. "I am saying that men and women in this town, and vaqueros who came here in good faith to trade cattle, have been drinking foul water while Mr. Crane kept the clean spring for men he hoped would bring the railroad through his land. That is not an accusation born of spite. It is written in his own ledger, and it is written on the bodies of the sick, and I would be glad, Mr. Crane, for you to prove me wrong instead of merely offended." Crane's eyes flicked once toward the sheriff's office across the street, where Sheriff Otis Boyd stood in the doorway with his thumbs hooked in his belt, and a look on his face like a man watching a poker hand he badly wanted to fold. Nobody moved to help him decide. "This is Ortiz's business," Crane said finally, his voice climbing a register. "Everyone here knows Don Rafael, and his people have been sore about that spring since I bought the land legal, fair and square from the county. It would not surprise me one bit if some of his vaqueros salted that well themselves to make trouble for a man doing honest business with the railroad." A new voice answered him from the edge of the crowd, low and controlled, in accented English that had clearly been practiced against exactly this kind of moment. "My vaqueros are lying in their bedrolls with fevers that near killed 2 of them last night, Mr. Crane. If you believe they poisoned their own water to make a point, you have a very low opinion of men who have watered their cattle from that spring since before your grandfather crossed the Sabine." Don Rafael Ortiz stood tall in the doorway of the Mercantile, hat in hand out of respect for the crowd of women present, but his eyes were flint. Beside him, half a step back, his daughter Carmen kept one hand resting protectively on the shoulder of a boy no older than 10 who was flushed and shivering despite the warm afternoon. Crane looked from the sick child to the crowd's faces and understood, in the particular way of men who have built their whole lives on being liked, that he had lost this exchange in the open street. He turned on his heel instead of answering, saying only that he had business at the depot and that this matter would be settled properly, through proper channels, and not by a girl with a broken jar and a male rider with an opinion above his station. The crowd began to break apart into knots of whispering neighbors, and Elsie let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. It was then that Vernon Wells came to stand beside her, close enough that she caught the smell of horse and leather and trail dust on him, and said quietly, "That took some nerve, standing up in front of the whole street like that." "Somebody had to," she said. "My father is laid up in San Antonio with a broken leg, and half the men in this town would rather look the other way than cross Silas Crane. I have been translating for Don Rafael since I was 12 years old. I was not about to stand by and let this happen to his people, because nobody wanted to make trouble for the man who might bring the railroad through." Vernon studied her for a moment, the sun catching the loose strands of dark hair that had escaped her braid, and something in his chest that had been shut tight for 3 years creaked open, just a hair's width. "Well," he said, "I have carried that man's mail for 2 years, and I never liked the way he looked at a ledger like it was scripture. Seems like today proved me right." "You did not have to say what you said," Elsie told him. "You could have kept riding." "I could have," Vernon agreed, "but I have never once in my life carried a letter partway and turned back because the road got hard. Seemed a poor time to start." She looked at him then with something sharper than gratitude, an appraisal, and he found he did not mind being measured by her at all. The town of Concho Springs sat where the North Concho River bent westward through a shallow valley of mesquite and buffalo grass, close enough to Fort Concho that soldiers still rode through twice a month, close enough to the Western Trail that every spring and summer the streets filled with the smell of trail dust and branded cattle bawling in the pens by the depot. It had grown up around Walter Ramsey's Mercantile and a stage stop, and in the 8 years since, it had gathered a church, a schoolhouse, 2 saloons, a blacksmith, a doctor's shingle, and Silas Crane's ice house and freight office, the only enterprise in 100 miles that could keep beef and butter cold through a Texas summer. It was 1885. And the talk in every saloon and church pew alike was of whether the Texas and Pacific Line might someday run a spur down from the main track to load cattle straight onto rail cars, instead of driving them all the way to Dodge City. Crane had staked his whole future, and a good portion of the town's hope, on being the man who made that happen. Elsie Ramsey had grown up behind the counter of her father's store, weighing flour and measuring calico since she was tall enough to see over the scale. Her mother, Rosa Delgado Ramsey, had come from a ranching family near San Antonio, and had died of consumption when Elsie was 16, leaving her fluent in 2 languages and unusually comfortable moving between the Anglo cattlemen who filled her father's store and the Tejano families who had ranched this stretch of the Concho since before Texas had ever been a republic. When trouble needed talking through instead of shooting through, more than one rancher on either side of that old divide had come looking for Elsie Ramsey to make sure both sides heard the same words. Vernon Wells had ridden the Star Route contract mail between Concho Springs and the Fort Concho Depot for going on 3 years, 110 miles round trip that he rode twice weekly, rain or shine, carrying letters, small packages, occasional bank drafts, and whatever news the telegraph office at the fort had not already beaten him to town with. He was 32 years old, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had spent a decade in the saddle, with a quiet, watchful manner that some mistook for coldness, until they saw him dismount to walk his horse through a hard patch of road rather than push the animal, or noticed that he always arrived when he said he would arrive. His wife Margaret had died of a flash fever 3 winters past while he was 5 days out on his route in a bad storm, and no rider could have made it back faster than he had, and it had not mattered, and some door in him had closed that had never fully opened again. He had told himself since then that the one thing a man could control on this earth was whether he kept his word, and so he had built his whole life around never again being the reason help came too late. That night, after the confrontation on the street, Vernon found himself in the Mercantile far later than he had planned, ostensibly buying tobacco and a new set of stirrup leathers, in truth unwilling to ride out toward the fort while there was still trouble brewing behind him in Concho Springs. "You are not fooling me, Mr. Wells," Elsie said, counting change into his palm from behind the counter. Lamplight softened the sharp lines of worry around her eyes. "You do not need stirrup leathers. Yours looked fine this afternoon." "Maybe I like new leather," Vernon said, and the corner of his mouth twitched. "Maybe you are waiting to see if Silas Crane's friends come looking for trouble tonight." He did not deny it. "You made a hard accusation in front of half this town today. A man like Crane does not care for being made small in public. I would rather be nearby than back at the Fort Depot if he decides to answer you with something other than words." Elsie set the coins on the counter rather than in his hand, an old habit of not wanting to be beholden to anyone's protection, though something in his plain honesty made her soften the gesture with a small, tired smile. "I have run this store through worse than an angry mayor. My father taught me to load a shotgun before he taught me to add a column of figures." "I do not doubt it," Vernon said. "But there is a difference between one angry man and a crowd that has been told a lie loud enough and often enough to believe it is the truth. I have ridden past enough burned line shacks and salted wells in my time to know how fast a rumor turns into a rope." Something in his voice, low and certain, made her look at him more closely. "You sound like a man speaking from more than caution." "I am speaking from having arrived too late to things before," he said, and then, as though he had let more slip than he intended, he touched the brim of his hat and said he had best see to his horse before it got full dark. She watched him go, boots sounding unhurried on the boardwalk outside, and found herself thinking that there was a great deal held quiet behind that steady face, and that she wanted, in a way that surprised her, to know what it was. The next 2 days passed with the strange, taut calm of a town waiting to see which way a storm would break. Doc Abernathy, the town's only physician, moved between the sickbeds of the Ortiz camp and 2 afflicted trail hands bunking behind the livery, dosing them with what quinine and charcoal tonic he had on hand, and grimly noting that his own supply would not last the week if the sickness spread further, which it was likely to do so long as anyone still drew water from the town well. Elsie kept the Mercantile open from dawn until well past dark, selling out her stock of clean bottled water and boiled cider faster than her father's supplier in San Antonio could resupply her, and taking in, without a second thought, 3 of the youngest Ortiz children whose mothers were too sick themselves to mind them. It was on the third morning that the real medicine Vernon had been waiting on finally arrived at the Fort Concho depot. A case of proper fever tonic and diphtheria serum, ordered weeks earlier by Doc Abernathy from a supply house in San Antonio, urgently needed now that 2 of the youngest Vaqueros' children had taken the fever hard. Vernon signed for it himself and rode the 55 miles back to Concho Springs in a single day rather than his usual 2, changing horses at the Delgado Way station along the route and pushing through the last stretch by lantern light because he had promised Doc Abernathy, and through him promised Carmen Ortiz, that the medicine would be in town by nightfall. He arrived just past 9 o'clock to find the freight office dark and locked, and Silas Crane's clerk nowhere to be found, and it took him only a moment of hammering on the door before he understood, with a cold, settling certainty, that the case of medicine he had been told to route through Crane's freight office for proper customs record had never left the depot at all. It sat, unopened, in a back room of the freight office, where it had been quietly held for 2 days on Crane's private order, the excuse being some invented delay in paperwork, the true reason being that Crane did not want any physical proof arriving in town that might draw the doctor's attention more closely to how many people were sick, or why. Vernon broke the lock himself with the butt of his revolver, a thing he had never done to another man's property in his life, and carried the case the 4 blocks to Doc Abernathy's surgery, where a boy named Miguel Ortiz, 9 years old and burning with fever, lay in a cot beside his sister. 2 more days, Doc Abernathy said grimly, examining the dosage, and this would not have mattered at all. Vernon said nothing, but something hard and old settled into place behind his eyes, a memory of another sick room 3 winters back that he had arrived at just as the church bell had started to toll, and he understood then that whatever line still separated him from getting fully involved in this town's fight had just been crossed for good. Word of the withheld medicine spread through Concho Springs faster than the fever itself. By midday, half the town had heard some version of it, and Silas Crane, cornered at last with no ledger to hide behind and no crowd left willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, made the decision that would tip the whole town into open danger. He rode out to the trail camp where 300 head of cattle and 20 rough hired hands were bedded down waiting to push north, and he told them, in a voice thick with practiced outrage, that the Ortiz Vaqueros had deliberately fouled the town well out of old grudges over the land, and that now, having been caught, they were spreading lies about good honest businessmen to cover their own crime. It was not true, and it did not need to be true. It only needed to be believed by enough men with guns and long memories of range disputes and old prejudice, and Silas Crane had chosen his audience well. By the time the sun began to sink that evening, a crowd of nearly 40 men, trail hands, and a handful of Crane's loyal freight workers among them, had gathered at the edge of town with rifles and torches, muttering about riding out to the Ortiz camp to teach a lesson before any more good Texans got sick from Mexican poison. Sheriff Boyd, caught between his fear of Crane and his fear of what 40 armed men might do, did nothing at all beyond suggesting weakly that everyone go home and sleep on it. It was Carmen Ortiz who came pounding on the mercantile's back door just after dark, her father and half a dozen of his least sick vaqueros behind her, with 2 wagons of women and children, having fled their camp the moment word reached them of the mob forming. "They are coming," Carmen said, breathless, her English fraying at the edges with fear. "My father says we cannot outride them with the sick ones in the wagons. Elsie, please." Elsie did not hesitate. "Get them inside, all of them, now." What followed in the hour after was a scramble that Elsie would remember for the rest of her life, as the moment her father's mercantile stopped being a store and became something closer to a fort. She sent the store's one remaining clerk, a nervous young man named Purdy, running to fetch what other help he could find, and watched him disappear down the street and simply not come back, having decided, like most of the town's able men that night, that whatever was about to happen at Ramsey's Mercantile was not worth risking his own skin over. He was not alone. The blacksmith bolted his shop and rode out toward San Angelo before the mob had even fully gathered. Two of the deputies Sheriff Boyd might have called on quietly saddled their horses and left town altogether, muttering about visiting kin. Even Doc Abernathy, torn between his duty to his patients and a very reasonable fear of gunfire, retreated to his surgery on the far side of town and barred his own doors rather than come to the Mercantile, though he sent word that he would tend anyone brought to him after, provided they survived the getting there. Man after man in Concho Springs weighed the cost of standing against Silas Crane's mob and found himself somewhere else to be. Elsie barred the front doors, dragged two heavy flour barrels against the shutters of the front windows, and set every lamp in the store to low so as not to make an easy target of the glass. She counted heads in the lamplight. Don Rafael Ortiz, his hand pressed to a rib injury from a fall off his spooked horse, Carmen, 6 vaqueros, 2 of them too fevered to stand, 4 women, and 5 children including Miguel, still weak from his fever but breathing easier now that the serum had done its work. "We will not be able to hold this building against 40 armed men," Don Rafael said quietly, checking the loads in his own revolver, one of the few weapons among them. "We are not going to fight 40 armed men," Elsie said. "We are going to make it so they cannot pretend, when the sun comes up, that what they are doing here is anything other than murder of women and children in a dry goods store. And we are going to hold them off with words for as long as it takes for someone with sense to come to their senses." It was a thin plan, and she knew it, but it was the only one she had, and she set about it with the same steady competence she brought to balancing her father's ledgers. She distributed what firearms the store carried among the vaqueros well enough to hold them, positioned the women and children in the storeroom at the back, behind the thickest wall, and set herself at the front counter with the store's ledger book and a lamp, because she intended, if anyone came asking, to be seen clearly as the one speaking, not hiding. The mob reached the Mercantile a little after 10 o'clock, torchlight flickering long shadows down the boardwalk. Silas Crane conspicuously absent from its front ranks, though his voice could be heard somewhere behind, urging the men on. A big, sunburned trail boss named Garrett Hobbs pounded on the barred door with the butt of his rifle. "We know they're in there, Miss Ramsey," he shouted. "Send out the greasers that poisoned that well and nobody needs to get hurt." Elsie stepped close to the shuttered window, close enough that her voice would carry through the gap, and answered him in English clear enough for the whole street to hear. "There is no one in this store who poisoned anything, Mr. Hobbs. There is a rancher with a broken rib, 4 women, 5 sick children, and 6 men who have done nothing tonight but flee from a mob that wants to hang somebody for a crime that Silas Crane committed with his own 2 hands. If you want to shoot into a store full of children to satisfy Silas Crane's temper, you go right ahead, but every man in this crowd will answer for it in the morning, in front of God and the county sheriff at San Angelo, and I will make certain every newspaper between here and Austin knows exactly whose name to print." There was a long, ugly pause, punctuated by the shuffling of boots and low, uncertain muttering. Somewhere in the dark a rifle was cocked, and Elsie's heart climbed into her throat, but she did not step back from the window. "She's lying," came Crane's voice, further back, thin and reedy against the low rumble of the crowd. "Don't listen to her, she's protecting them. Everyone knows she's half what Silas." Elsie's voice cut across his like a blade. "Half of a family that has ranched this river longer than your freight office has stood. Say it plain if you mean to say it, so every man here can hear exactly what kind of poison you are trying to spread tonight, because it is not coming from any well." The silence that followed was different from the first, heavier, and Elsie understood that she had landed a blow that mattered, though she could not yet tell which way the night would tip. The siege, as the town would come to call it in the years after, held through that first night in a fragile, terrible standoff. No shots were fired, but none of the mob dispersed either, and by the gray light of dawn Elsie's arms ached from holding the shotgun steady at the counter, and her voice had gone hoarse from hours of talking men back from the edge of their own worst impulses, one exchange at a time, translating not between languages now, but between fear and reason. Inside, the children slept in exhausted fits against their mothers, and Don Rafael kept his post by the storeroom door despite the pain in his ribs, and Carmen Ortiz sat beside Elsie through the long hours, occasionally correcting a word or adding a detail that steadied the vaqueros' resolve when their nerve threatened to break. By mid-morning of the second day, the crowd outside had thinned to perhaps 20 determined men, the rest having drifted off to nurse hangovers or reconsider their commitment to a fight that had produced no violence and no confession, only a long, stubborn, exhausting standoff against a woman who would not stop talking sense at them through a shuttered window. Food inside the mercantile ran low. Elsie rationed crackers and dried apples with the same careful hand she used weighing flour for paying customers, and melted the last of the store's block ice into drinking water for the children. It was near noon on that second day that the sound of hooves came pounding up the far end of the street, and for one terrible moment Elsie feared it was Crane bringing reinforcements. Instead it was Vernon Wells, 3 days late on his scheduled route and riding a horse near lathered white with exhaustion, with the old Ranger veteran Amos Kittredge, the blacksmith's father, and Reverend Josiah Hale, and most tellingly, the railroad surveyor Jonathan Pierce, riding hard behind him. Vernon had heard of the mob forming from a rancher along his route the previous evening, and had turned his horse straight around rather than continue to the fort, riding through the night to gather what honest men he could find scattered along the outlying ranches, men who owed him favors from years of faithfully carrying their mail through blizzards and floods, men who trusted his word absolutely, because he had never once given them reason not to. He reined up hard in the street between the mercantile and the remaining crowd, and his voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried the particular weight of a man the whole valley had learned to trust without question. "Whoever fires the first shot here today," Vernon said, "answers to me personally, and then to a federal marshal, because obstructing a United States mail contractor and destroying government freight is exactly what Silas Crane did 2 nights past when he locked up medicine meant for sick children in his own freight office. I have the broken lock to prove it, and Doc Abernathy to testify to it. And I expect there's a judge in San Angelo who would take a very unkind view of a mob that finished the job Crane started by burning down a mercantile full of women and children." Jonathan Pierce, the railroad surveyor, pushed his horse forward beside Vernon, his engineer's coat dusty from the ride, and addressed the crowd in the clipped tone of a man used to being listened to by men with money at stake. "I have spent 3 weeks in this town evaluating whether the Texas and Pacific ought to run a spur down to your stockyards. I can tell you plainly, gentlemen, that no railroad company in the country invests a single dollar in a town that burns its own citizens alive over a lie told by a water monopolist trying to hide contaminated freight. You want your railroad? Then you had best disperse, and you had best let the truth get told, because I intend to write exactly what I saw here in my report either way." That did more to break the crowd's remaining will than any threat of the law could have. Men who had ridden out the night before dreaming of a spur line and steady railroad wages now understood, with the particular clarity of self-interest, that the mob they were part of stood squarely in the way of the very future they wanted. One by one, then in 2s and 3s, the remaining men lowered their rifles, muttered excuses, and began drifting back toward the saloon or the trail camp, until only Garrett Hobbs remained, standing uncertain in the street. "She said the mayor did this," Hobbs said slowly, looking between Vernon and the barred mercantile door. "That true?" "It is true," Vernon said, "and you nearly helped him cover it up with a rope." Hobbs swore under his breath, spat in the dust, and turned his horse away without another word. The bar came off the mercantile door a few minutes later, and Elsie stepped out into the daylight for the first time in nearly 2 days, blinking against the brightness. Her hair come loose from its braid, powder smudged on her hands from where she had loaded the shotgun through the long night. Vernon swung down from his horse and crossed the street to her in 3 long strides, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, simply looking at each other across the small distance, both of them undone in ways that had nothing to do with the crowd dispersing behind them. "You held them off 2 days," Vernon said finally, his voice rough. "You came back," Elsie said, as though that were the more remarkable fact. "I told you once I have never turned back on a road because it got hard," Vernon said. "I did not mean to make you find out the hard way that I meant it." Elsie's throat tightened, and she did not trust herself to answer with words, so she simply reached out and gripped his forearm, hard, the way one gripped a person real and solid after believing for 2 days that no help was coming at all. Vernon covered her hand with his own, and for the length of several heartbeats, the noise of the dispersing crowd and the frightened children still inside the store, and the whole complicated danger of the last 3 days fell away to something smaller and quieter between the two of them. Silas Crane, meanwhile, had not remained to watch his mob dissolve. He had slipped away toward the depot the moment Jonathan Pierce's warning had turned the crowd's mood, intending, it would later come out, to catch the next stage south before anyone thought to arrest him. He did not get the chance because of what happened next. The wind that afternoon came up dry and hot out of the west, the kind of wind that in a good year meant nothing more than dust in a man's eyes. But that year had followed 6 weeks without rain, and the buffalo grass on the flats around Concho Springs stood brown and brittle as kindling. No one ever determined for certain whether it was an overturned lantern in the abandoned trail camp, or a dropped cigarette from one of the departing mob, or simply a spark thrown up by cookfare coals not properly doused in the haste of the last 2 days' chaos. But by 2 o'clock that afternoon, a thin line of smoke rose up from the flats south of the stockyards, and within 20 minutes it had become a wall of orange flame racing before the wind straight toward the pens, the depot, and the town itself. The cry of fire went up from the depot first, and within moments the whole street was in motion again, though this time the fear was shared equally by every soul in Concho Springs, regardless of which side of the last 2 days' trouble they had stood on. Vernon was already moving before the second shout finished echoing down the street, swinging back up onto his exhausted horse, and calling out orders with the unhesitating clarity of a man who had spent years reading weather and terrain on his long rides. "We cannot outrun it on the flats," he shouted to the men gathering in confusion around the stockyard fence, "but we can starve it. Plow lines, wide as you can cut them, from the depot road down to the river bend. Anyone with a wagon and a blade, hitch it now." Amos Kittredge, still mounted from riding in with Vernon that morning, took up the call at once, directing men toward the few plows and harrows kept at the livery. Don Rafael Ortiz, despite his cracked rib, mounted one of the fresher horses and rode out with 3 of his least sick vaqueros to help drive the frightened cattle out of the pens and away from the fire's path, rather than let 300 head burn where they stood. Reverend Hale organized the women and older children into bucket lines from the river to wet down the rooftops nearest the flats, and Elsie, without needing to be told twice, threw open the mercantile storeroom and began handing out every blanket, every yard of canvas, every barrel that could hold water, calling out instructions in both English and Spanish, so that no one, regardless of which language came easiest to them, mistook where they were needed. "Wet the blankets in the river first," she called to a cluster of trail hands who only that morning had stood in the mob outside her store. "Then lay them over the roofs closest to the flats. Canvas over the feed store, it will catch first with all that hay inside. Garrett Hobbs, the trail boss who had turned away in shame that morning, found himself taking orders from the very woman he had threatened to burn out hours before, and to his credit, he did not hesitate, driving his men toward the feed store with the same energy he had brought to the mob the night before, now aimed at something worth the effort. Vernon worked the plow line himself, driving a borrowed team back and forth along the depot road, cutting a raw brown scar through the dry grass wide enough to starve the fire of fuel when it reached that stretch, sweat and ash streaking his face, his voice hoarse from shouting directions to the men working alongside him. The fire came on faster than any of them liked, a roaring orange wall visible now above the mesquite line, throwing embers on the wind that landed hissing in the dust of the street, and had to be stamped out one by children too small to do much else in the effort. It was Elsie who spotted the danger to the depot itself, where Jonathan Pierce's survey documents and, more urgently, 3 barrels of blasting powder kept for grading work sat exposed in an open shed dangerously near the fire's likely path. She ran the 200 yards from the mercantile herself, calling for help, and it was Vernon who reached her first, having seen her running and abandoned the plow line to follow. Together they rolled the powder barrels clear across the depot yard and down toward the riverbank, out of any spark's reach, working in a rhythm that needed no words between them, each anticipating the other's next motion as though they had labored side by side for years rather than days. By the time the fire reached the plowed line along the depot road, it found no fuel to carry it further, and though it burned hot and long against that raw earth scar, it could not leap the gap, and slowly, over the space of another hour, it guttered and died back into smoking black stubble across the flats where the trail camp had stood. It was Sheriff Boyd, of all people, who found Sela's Crane an hour later, not fleeing toward the depot as he had intended, but cowering behind his own ice house where the fire's smoke had briefly cut off his escape route toward the stage road, having abandoned the box of documents he had been trying to save in his panic to save himself instead. Whatever authority Crane had held in Concho Springs burned away in that hour as surely as the grass on the flats, because there was no rumor left strong enough to survive the sight of the man who had caused all this trouble, found sniveling behind a woodpile, while women and trail hands who owed him nothing had fought the fire shoulder to save his own town. Sheriff Boyd, perhaps ashamed of his own 2 days of silence, arrested Crane there in the ash and smoke, on charges of fraud, obstruction of the United States mail, and endangerment stemming from the fouled well, with Jonathan Pierce standing as a witness that the railroad company would want a full accounting of the freight office's dealings before any spur line was so much as discussed further. By evening, the fire was fully out, the cattle recovered and reasonably calm, and Concho Springs stood scorched at its edges but whole, its people gathered in exhausted, soot-streaked clusters along the street, trading water dippers and stories of the last 2 hours with the particular closeness of neighbors who had faced something dangerous together and come through it. Elsie found herself, near dusk, sitting on the mercantile's front step beside Carmen Ortiz, both of them filthy with ash and grinning at each other with the giddy relief of survivors, while inside, Doc Abernathy pronounced Miguel Ortiz's fever fully broken and the boy's appetite, judging by the noise he was making over a plate of beans, thoroughly recovered. Vernon found her there a little while later, having finally seen to his exhausted horse, and lowered himself onto the step beside her with a groan that spoke to 2 days without proper sleep. "I believe," he said, "that this is the longest mail route I have ever ridden that did not involve a single mile of actual mail delivery." Elsie laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her by how tired and how alive she felt all at once. "You are 3 days late to Fort Concho. I expect the postmaster there will forgive me, given the circumstances." "I expect he will," she said, and then quieter, "Thank you, Vernon, for coming back." He turned his head to look at her properly, the last orange light of sunset catching the smudge of ash along her cheekbone, and something in his chest that had been guarded shut for 3 years opened another degree wider. "I keep telling you," he said, "I do not know how to do anything else." The days that followed the fire settled into a strange, busy peace. Silas Crane was held under guard until a circuit judge could arrive from San Angelo to hear formal charges. His freight office and ice house placed under temporary management of the county, while the fraud was sorted out. And word came within the week that the railroad company, far from abandoning Concho Springs over the scandal, had in fact decided the town's conduct during the fire, and the honesty with which its people had exposed the fraud rather than covering it up, spoke well enough of the community that Jonathan Pierce recommended the spur line proceed after all, provided a new, properly regulated water system was built to serve both the town and the surrounding ranches fairly. Ortiz. Land included. That recommendation came with it a substantial sum, offered jointly by the railroad company as a token of goodwill and by the county as recovered damages from Crane's seized assets, earmarked for whoever the town designated as having been most instrumental in exposing the fraud and saving the survey camp during the fire. Every soul in Concho Springs understood without needing to be told that this meant Elsie Ramsey and Vernon Wells. But that reckoning came a little later. First, the town wanted to celebrate. It was Reverend Hale who proposed the gathering, a full week after the fire, once the last of the smoke smell had faded from the air, and the well diggers hired from San Angelo had begun the work of sinking a new shared well fed properly from Cottonwood Spring, with pipes laid to carry clean water not only to the town, but out along the river road to the Ortiz Ranch and the other Tejano families who had been quietly excluded from the old arrangement for years. A dance, he said, right there in the churchyard, with fiddles and lanterns, and every family in the valley invited regardless of which side of the old divide they had stood on, to celebrate the town's survival and to bless the ground being broken for the new well. The evening of the dance came clear and warm, the kind of soft, fair Texas evening that seemed to belong to an entirely different season than the smoke and fear of the week before. Lanterns strung between the church's porch posts threw a golden light across the churchyard, and 2 fiddlers and a man with a guitar struck up a reel that had half the town's boots moving before the first verse was finished. Long tables groaned under dishes brought by every household, tamales beside cornbread beside peach cobbler, in a mingling that would have seemed unthinkable in Concho Springs only 2 weeks earlier. Elsie had put on her good blue dress, the one she rarely had occasion to wear behind the counter of the mercantile, and had let Carmen talk her into pinning her hair up properly instead of the practical braid she wore for work. She was standing near the punch table, laughing at something Carmen had said about the county judge's mustache, when she looked up to find Vernon Wells crossing the churchyard toward her, hat in hand, wearing a clean-pressed shirt she suspected he had borrowed rather than owned, looking, for the first time since she had met him, faintly nervous. "Miss Ramsey," he said, with a formality that did not quite match the color rising along his collar, "I wonder if you would do me the honor of a dance. I wonder if you know how to dance, Mr. Wells, or if you are only better acquainted with the back of a horse." "I confess my dancing is rustier than my riding," Vernon admitted, "but I have been reliably informed by Reverend Hale's wife that a man who can sit a horse through a Texas norther can manage a reel if he sets his mind to it." She laughed and let him lead her out among the other couples, and if his steps were a little stiff at first, they found their rhythm quickly enough, and by the second turn of the dance she had stopped noticing his feet at all and had started noticing instead the warmth of his hand at her waist, the steady, careful way he guided her through the turns, as though she were something precious rather than something to be led, the low, private smile he wore that she had not seen on him before that evening. "You are a different man out here than you are on that mail route," she said, when the reel slowed into something gentler. "AMI, you are always so careful, guarded. As though you are keeping something behind a locked door." She said it lightly, but her eyes searched his face for the truth of it. Vernon was quiet for a long moment, his hand tightening slightly at her waist as the music wound down and the dance floor around them thinned. "I had a wife," he said finally. "Margaret. We were married 4 years. She took a fever 3 winters back, a bad one, the kind that comes on fast in a hard winter, and I was 5 days out on the route in a storm that would not let me turn back, not in time to matter. By the time I made it home, the church bell had already tolled. I have spent every day since telling myself that the one thing I could still control, the one promise I could keep absolutely, was never again being the reason help came too late to someone who needed it." Elsie's hand found his where it rested at her waist, and she did not let go. "I am sorry, Vernon, truly. I do not tell you this to make you sorry," he said. "I tell you because I do not want you to wonder later why I hold myself the way I do and think it has anything to do with you. It does not. You are the first person since Margaret that I have wanted to let all the way past that locked door, and I find that frightens me a good deal more than any mob or any wildfire ever has." She looked at him steadily, feeling her own old guardedness rise, not from fear of him but from a fear she had carried quietly since the first week she had known him. "I will not be a woman who spends her life standing in a dead woman's shadow, Vernon. I have watched other women do that, marry a widower and spend the rest of their days measured against a memory they can never win against. I like you a great deal. I think perhaps I am beginning to love you. But I will not compete with a ghost, and if that is what you are offering, I would rather know it now, before either of us is hurt worse for the waiting." "That is not what I am offering," Vernon said, and there was no hesitation in it now, only a quiet, complete certainty. "Margaret was my wife, and I loved her, and I grieve her still, and I expect I always will some. But loving you is not a betrayal of that, Elsie, and it is not a second-best version of anything. It is its own thing entirely. You stood in a besieged store for 2 days talking a mob back from murder with nothing but words and nerve, and you organized a whole town into fighting a wildfire before I had even finished shouting the first order. And I have never in my life met anyone, Margaret included, God rest her, who I admired the way I admire you. I'm not asking you to fill a space she left. I am asking you to build something new that is entirely only yours and mine." The last of the fiddle music faded around them, and neither of them moved to step apart, and when Vernon leaned down and kissed her, gently, there in the lantern light with half the town still milling nearby, Elsie kissed him back without a single reservation left standing between them. They did not marry the next week, though the town would have gossiped happily if they had. Instead, in the weeks that followed, they built something slower and, Elsie thought, sturdier for the building of it. Vernon continued his mail route, though he arranged with the postmaster to base his home in Concho Springs rather than the smaller relay station he had used before, and he took to stopping at the Mercantile at the end of every route, not for supplies he did not need, but simply to see her, to help her lift crates too heavy for one person, to sit with her over coffee while she balanced the day's ledger, and tell her about the small kindnesses and small troubles of the ranches along his road. The circuit judge arrived in early autumn and heard the case against Silas Crane in a courtroom packed with more of Concho Springs citizens than the little building had ever held before. The evidence, laid out plainly by Elsie's careful documentation, Vernon's testimony as to the freight manifests and the withheld medicine, and Doc Abernathy's medical account of the sickness the fouled well had caused, left little room for argument. Crane was convicted of fraud and obstruction and sentenced to a term at the state penitentiary, his ice house and freight office sold at auction, the proceeds going, by the judge's order, into the same county fund already earmarked for the new water system. It was Jonathan Pierce, on behalf of the railroad company, and Sheriff Boyd, on behalf of the county, who came to the Mercantile one crisp October morning with a leather satchel and a great deal of formal language about the town's gratitude, intending to present Elsie Ramsey and Vernon Wells with a joint sum of $800, a considerable fortune by the standards of Concho Springs in 1885. In recognition of their part in exposing the fraud and saving the survey camp during the fire, Elsie and Vernon exchanged a single look across the counter, a look that needed no words at all, before Elsie spoke for them both. "We are grateful for the town's kindness in wanting to honor us," she said. "But I did not stand in that store for 2 days to earn money, and Vernon did not ride through the night to gather help because he wanted a reward for it. We would like, if the county and the railroad are willing, for this money to go toward the well and the bridge the town has been needing for years, the one that would let the Ortiz Ranch and the other families along the river cross safely in high water instead of fording at the risk of their lives every spring. And we would like a portion set aside for Doc Abernathy's surgery, so that no family in this valley is ever again left waiting on medicine that a man of business decided to hold back for his own profit." Vernon nodded beside her. "Whatever this town chooses to build with that money, it ought to be something that outlasts the two of us and helps folks who never asked for a reward at all. That seems the fitter use of it." Sheriff Boyd looked for a moment as though he might argue, but Jonathan Pierce only smiled and said that he had rather expected an answer along those lines, and that the railroad company would be glad to add its own contribution toward a proper iron bridge across the Concho, given how well the town's honesty had served everyone's interests in the end. The bridge was raised the following spring, sturdy timber and iron trestle spanning the river at the crossing the Ortiz family had used for 3 generations, wide enough now for wagons to pass safely even in the swollen high water of a wet season. And the new well, dug deep and true from Cottonwood Spring with pipes laid to carry water fairly to every household in the valley, Anglo and Tejano alike, was set with a stone marker at its head, carved with the date and the words, "At Don Rafael Ortiz's insistence, water for all who thirst, without division." Elsie and Vernon were married that same spring in the churchyard where they had first danced, under the same lantern light strung between the same porch posts, with Carmen Ortiz standing beside Elsie in a dress they had sewn together over the long winter evenings, and Amos Kittredge standing beside Vernon looking prouder than if the wedding had been his own. Don Rafael Ortiz gave the bride away in the absence of Walter Ramsey, who had returned from San Antonio with his leg healed, just in time to walk his daughter down the aisle himself, weeping openly and without shame at the sight of her. Vernon kept his male root, because it was who he was, and Elsie would not have wanted him to give up any part of himself to become her husband, but he wrote it now from a home they built together on a small parcel of land just outside town, close enough to the mercantile that Elsie could keep her father's store, close enough to the new bridge that they could hear, some evenings, the creak of wagon wheels crossing safely over water that had once run only one way, to only some of the people who needed it. On the evening of their wedding, as the fiddles struck up the first reel of the celebration and half the valley gathered once more in that same churchyard, now healed and rebuilt and joined in ways it had never quite managed before, Vernon took his wife's hand and led her out onto the dancing ground, and this time there was no nervousness in his step at all, only a steady, certain joy. "I once told you," he said low just for her as they turned together under the lantern light, "that I have never in my life turned back on a road because it got hard." "I remember," Elsie said, smiling up at him. "I find now," Vernon said, "that I have finally reached the end of that particular road. Right here, with you." "That is a fine place to end a road, Vernon Wells," she said, and kissed him again, there in front of the whole valley, without a single reservation left in her heart, while the fiddles played on and the new bridge stood solid over the river behind them, and the water from the shared well ran clean and cold, and fairly divided among every household in Concho Springs, exactly as it should have from the start.